The moment Julia Hadley stepped through the wide double doors of the Abilene stockyards on that hot Tuesday morning in June of 1878, every conversation in the building stopped dead, as though the air itself had been snatched right out from under those weathered rafters. She had expected it. She had braced herself for it the entire 12-mile wagon ride into town, sitting straight-backed on the buckboard with her late father's ledger pressed against her lap, rehearsing every number she intended to bid, every argument she intended to make if any man dared to tell her she did not belong. She had expected the stares, the murmurs, the slow and deliberate sweeping of eyes from the crown of her straw hat all the way down to her sensible boots. What she had not expected was how loud the silence would be. There were perhaps 60 men crowded into the long rectangular hall that smelled of sawdust, manure, and pipe smoke. They stood in clusters along the wooden railing that overlooked the holding pens below, or leaned against the support beams with their arms crossed, or sat on the rough-hewn benches arranged in slanting rows toward the front where the auctioneer's platform stood. Every single one of them was looking at her. Not one of them moved to offer so much as a polite nod. Julia lifted her chin exactly the way her father had taught her to do when the world decided to be unkind, and she walked forward. She was 26 years old, and the Hadley ranch was the only thing in the world she had left. Her father, Robert Hadley, had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving her the house, the land, the debts, and 23 remaining head of cattle that were not near enough to carry the operation through another year. What she needed today, more than she had ever needed anything in her life, was a breeding bull, the kind that could rebuild a depleted herd in 2 seasons if managed right. Her father had always said the right bull was worth more than gold, and she believed him. She had spent 3 weeks saving every dollar she could scrape together, and she had a maximum of $92 to spend. She moved toward the open seating area and chose a spot near the middle of the second bench, settling her ledger on her knee and uncapping her small ink pen. She would take notes. She would be professional. She would not give any man in this building the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She had been seated for no more than 30 seconds when someone dropped onto the bench beside her, not across the aisle, not 2 rows back, but directly beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his arm. "Warm morning for June," the man said, as casually as though they were old acquaintances passing on a sidewalk. Julia turned to look at him. He was tall even sitting down, broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of genuine work rather than mere size, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar beneath a battered felt hat that had seen considerably better years. He had a square jaw dusted with 2 or 3 days of stubble, and eyes that were a shade of brown she could only describe as the color of the earth after a good rain, warm and deep and steady. He was, she guessed, somewhere near 30. He held his own battered notebook and was already flipping through it with the practiced ease of a man who had done this particular thing many times before. He was not looking at her the way the others had looked at her. He was not looking at her like she was a spectacle or a mistake or something that had wandered in through the wrong door. He was simply looking at her the way one person looks at another, open and without agenda, and something about that simple ordinary decency nearly undid her entirely. "It is," she said carefully, "warm morning." He offered his hand. "Frederick Collier. I run the Collier spread about 8 miles east of here." She shook it. His grip was firm, but not the kind of firm that tries to prove something. "Julia Hadley. Hadley Ranch, 12 miles south." Something shifted in his expression. "Robert Hadley's place." "My place," she said quietly, not unkindly but precisely. "Robert Hadley was my father. He passed last January." Frederick Collier held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something genuine move across his features. Not pity, which she would have resented, but something softer and more respectful than that. "I am sorry to hear it," he said. "Your father was a good man, fair dealer. He helped me get a reasonable price on a water easement 3 years ago when he didn't have to. I always intended to return the favor somehow." Julia stared at him. "I didn't know that." He wouldn't have mentioned it, Frederick said, with the faintest edge of a smile. That was the kind of man he was. She looked at him a moment longer, deciding something, and then she opened her ledger and turned her attention toward the front of the hall where the auctioneer, a round man in a green vest named Harold Pryor, was beginning to shuffle his papers and call the assembled men to attention. What Julia could not have known, sitting there in those first minutes, was that Frederick Collier had his own serious reasons for being at this particular auction on this particular morning, and that those reasons were about to become complicated in the most unexpectedly wonderful way. Frederick had come to Abilene to bid on a specific animal, a 3-year-old Hereford bull named Goliath, which the Pryor auction house had been advertising in the Abilene Chronicle for the past 2 weeks. Goliath had a documented bloodline that made any serious cattleman's pulse quicken, a deep chest, a calm temperament, and an already proven record of producing heavy calves. Frederick had been saving for him since February. He had $110 tucked into the inside pocket of his vest, and he had been fairly confident that would be enough to win the bid. The problem Frederick discovered within the first 20 minutes of the auction was that he was not the only one who had come specifically for Goliath. Across the aisle, lounging in the front row with his boots propped on the railing as though he already owned the place, was a man named Silas Drummond. Frederick knew Silas Drummond the way most people in Dickinson County knew him, which was to say, carefully and from a respectful distance. Drummond ran the largest cattle operation in the region, the kind of operation that bought up smaller ranches when they faltered, that diverted water sources through legal maneuvering when it suited him, that employed enough hands and enough lawyers to make most men think twice before crossing him. He was not an outlaw. There was nothing you could point at and call criminal. But there was a heaviness to his presence in any room that felt like the particular weight of a man, accustomed to getting precisely what he wanted by whatever means were available to him. Drummond had 3 men with him, all well-dressed, all quiet, all watching the room in the way that men watch a room when they have been paid to watch it. When the auctioneer called Goliath's lot number and the big Hereford was walked out into the display pen below, Frederick heard Drummond say something to the man beside him and laugh low in the back of his throat. Drummond had deep pockets and a casual cruelty toward competition. If he decided he wanted Goliath, he would simply outbid everyone in the room until the gavel came down in his favor. Frederick felt the familiar slow tightening in his chest that came whenever Drummond entered the picture. But then something happened that he did not expect. Beside him, Julia Hadley's pen went suddenly still on her ledger page. She was staring down at Goliath with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something fierce and determined and vulnerable all at the same time, like a person who has spotted the one thing that might save them and is desperately calculating whether they can reach it. "That one," she said, more to herself than to him. Frederick looked at her. "Goliath." She turned to him, and he could see the calculation working behind her eyes. "That bull is exactly what the Hadley herd needs. He's everything. The bloodline, the build, the temperament. If I can get him onto my land and work him right for 2 seasons, I can rebuild the herd to where it needs to be." She paused. "How high do you think the bidding will go?" Frederick looked at Drummond sprawled in the front row, and he felt something shift inside him. The honest answer was that Drummond would drive the price well past what most ordinary ranchers could afford, simply because Drummond preferred to acquire things by exhausting the competition. He had done it before with land and water rights and livestock. He would do it again today. He looked back at Julia Hadley, at the careful way she was holding her ledger, at the faint white line along her knuckles where she was gripping her pen a little too hard, at the absolutely composed and determined expression on her face that did not quite succeed in hiding how much was riding on this for her. He made a decision. He did not analyze it the way he perhaps should have. He did not sit there and weigh it and debate it with himself in the careful, methodical way he usually approached most things. Something just settled in him, quiet and certain. The way the right decision sometimes does when you stop overthinking it and simply recognize it for what it is. I've been after that same bull since February, he told her honestly. She blinked. Oh, a beat of silence. Then we are in competition. We might have been, he said, but I have a different proposal. She studied him with those clear hazel eyes that missed very little. I'm listening. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and spoke quietly enough that no one around them could follow the conversation. That man in the front row, green cravat, boots on the railing, that's Silas Drummond. You know him, a small shadow crossed her face. By reputation. His reputation is accurate, Frederick said. He has come here for Goliath specifically. I know it because I know Drummond, and I know the way he sits when he's already decided something is his. If he decides to drive the bidding up for sport, neither of us will be going home with that animal today. Julia was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, what are you proposing? You need that bull more than I do, Frederick said, and he meant it fully. He had other options. He had a working herd in some time. The Hadley operation, from what he could see in her eyes, did not have much time left. Let me be the one bidding. Drummond knows my face, knows roughly what my operation can afford, and he'll estimate my ceiling. He won't expect a second strategy. When the bidding gets high enough that Drummond thinks I'm about to fold, I want you to raise your card. Julia was staring at him. Why would you do that? He held her gaze steadily. Because your father once did something decent for me when he didn't have to. And because you walked into a room full of men who wanted to make you feel like you didn't belong, and you sat down anyway and opened your ledger like you had every right in the world to be here. Which you do. He paused. And because Drummond has been riding roughshod over smaller operations in this county for 3 years, and I am tired of watching him do it. The silence stretched between them for 2 or 3 heartbeats, and Frederick could see her deciding whether to trust him. He understood it. She had no particular reason to. He was a stranger on a bench at a cattle auction. He might be running some scheme she couldn't see the shape of yet. He understood all of that, and he waited. All right, she said at last. Tell me how. He explained it simply. He would open the bidding and push it steadily. He knew Drummond's tactic, which was to let other bidders establish the floor and then step in to dominate the middle rounds, forcing everyone else to either overpay or surrender. If Frederick could keep the bidding moving at a pace that made Drummond slightly impatient, and if Julia could come in at the precise right moment when Drummond was calculating that Frederick was nearly finished, they could potentially catch Drummond in a moment of overconfidence. It was not a foolproof plan. Frederick said so plainly, but it was a better chance than either of them had going in alone against a man with Drummond's resources. My ceiling is $92, Julia said, and he could hear the steadiness it cost her to say that number plainly to a near stranger. That was not easy, and he knew it. That might be enough, he said. Drummond won't expect you to be the one pushing the top of the bid. He's been ignoring you since you walked in. That's his mistake. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across her mouth, brief as a shadow. Men like him often make that mistake, she said. They do, Frederick agreed. Today we use it. Harold Pryor, the auctioneer, had the voice of a man who had been calling prices in dusty halls for 40 years, rapid and rhythmic, and joyful in a way that suggested he genuinely loved his work. He ran through 3 lots before Goliath's number came up, and both Frederick and Julia sat through those early lots with the particular focused quiet of people who are saving themselves for one specific moment. When Goliath was walked out into the display pen, big and deep-chested, and impressively calm for an animal of his size, there was a ripple of genuine appreciation through the crowd. Even the men who hadn't come for him could recognize quality. Harold Pryor began his opening remarks about the bloodline and the Pryor performance records, and Frederick felt the room sharpen. He glanced sideways at Julia and found her already looking at the pen with an expression of complete concentrated certainty. "Ready?" he murmured. "Ready," she said without looking at him. Frederick raised his bidding card. The opening bid was $40, standard for an animal of this quality. 2 other bidders came in immediately, a rancher from the back row Frederick vaguely recognized, and a man in a brown coat he didn't know. Drummond didn't move. He was watching from beneath the brim of his hat with that infuriating casual patience that meant he had already decided the outcome. 45, 50. The man in the brown coat dropped out. Frederick stayed in. The rancher from the back pushed to 55 and Frederick matched him, then raised to 60. The rancher hesitated and then settled back in his seat. Now it was Frederick in the open air. 60, 65. He bid against himself for 2 rounds and Harold Pryor called for any other takers, and that was when Drummond lifted his card for the first time. $70. Frederick bid 75 without hesitation. He heard Drummond make a short sound that might have been amusement or irritation, and then Drummond raised to 80. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they can feel something interesting is happening. Frederick bid 85. He watched Drummond consult briefly with the man beside him. Drummond was recalculating. He was trying to determine how deep Frederick's pockets actually went, whether this was real endurance or bluster. Drummond bid 90. Frederick felt the ceiling of his own strategy. He had $110, and he needed to hand this off at the exact right moment. He looked at Drummond, and then he made a very deliberate show of consulting his own notebook, turning pages, running his thumb down a column of figures with visible concern. He let a beat of hesitation sit in the air, just long enough for Drummond to see it and begin to relax. Then Frederick bid 91. Drummond's shoulders eased. That microscopic relaxation of a man who believes the last obstacle is nearly finished. He raised his card again. 92. Frederick lowered his card and leaned back slightly, making the slightest gesture of a man stepping away from the table. Drummond was already leaning forward, satisfied, the way you lean forward when you know the prize is coming. Julia raised her bidding card. She raised it cleanly and without hesitation, and without any of the nervous tremor that the situation might have warranted, because she was her father's daughter and she had Robert Hadley's steadiness in her bones. 93, called Harold Pryor, his voice lifting with the surprised pleasure of an auctioneer who has found another bidder in the room. We have a new bid at 93 from the young lady. Do I hear 94? The room turned. Every man in the building swung his attention toward Julia Hadley, and she did not flinch. She sat perfectly composed with her bidding card still raised and her ledger on her knee and her eyes fixed on Harold Pryor at the front of the room. Drummond turned too. Frederick watched his face change as he registered who had just outbid him, and what he saw there was not pretty. It was the particular cold displeasure of a man who has been caught off guard by someone he had dismissed entirely and who found that embarrassing rather than amusing. Drummond raised his card. 94. Julia bid 95, 96 from Drummond, 97 from Julia. Frederick watched Drummond's jaw tighten. He was not accustomed to being pushed by someone he'd already written off. He raised again. 98. Julia bid 99. There was a sound in the room now, not quite a murmur, not quite a cheer, something in between, the restless, fascinated noise of men watching a contest that has become genuinely unpredictable. $100 from Drummond. Frederick's hands were pressed flat against his thighs. Julia had $92. She had already gone $7 past her stated ceiling and he did not understand how, and then he understood. She had bid $99. She was still $1 under her actual ceiling. She had started $1 lower than she'd told him. She bid 101. Drummond's face did something complicated. He raised his card again, sharp and immediate, not quite controlled. 105. The room went utterly still. Julia lowered her bidding card to her knee. Her face was absolutely composed. Her pen was steady on her ledger. She had run out of room. Frederick felt it the instant it happened, felt the moment tilt the wrong direction, and he moved before he thought about it. He raised his own card cleanly in the air. 107, he said directly, bypassing Pryor's rhythm. Harold Pryor grinned like a man who has been given an unexpected gift and called it properly. 107 from the gentleman on the right. Drummond turned to look at Frederick directly, and his expression now was something considerably colder than displeasure. This had stopped being about a bull. 110 from Drummond. Frederick bid 112. He had 110 in his vest. The other $2 were a bluff that would require extremely quick thinking if the gavel came down in his favor. 115 from Drummond. The room held its breath. Frederick did not bid. He met Drummond's eyes across the aisle and he held them, steady and unhurried, and he did not bid. 115. Do I hear 116? Harold Pryor was watching Frederick. The room was watching Frederick. Drummond was watching Frederick with the flat and certain satisfaction of a man who has spent enough money to end the argument. 116, said Julia Hadley quietly. She said it without raising her card this time. She simply said it the way you state a fact that is not open for debate, and the clarity of her voice in that absolutely silent room was the most remarkable thing Frederick had heard in years. Harold Pryor's gavel came up. 116 from the lady. $116 going once. Do I hear 117? Drummond stared at her. She looked back at him with complete placid indifference, the way you look at weather. She had made her position entirely clear without a single additional word. She was not afraid of him. She would not be moved. Drummond did not bid. Going twice. The gavel came down. Sold to the lady for $116. The sound that went through the room was unlike anything Julia had anticipated. It started as a murmur and built into something that might, in a more dignified setting, have been called applause. Men were nodding at her, a few touching the brims of their hats. Harold Pryor was beaming from his platform. Even the men who had been most visibly unsettled by her presence at the beginning seemed to have been carried somewhere else by the drama of the last few minutes. Julia Hadley sat very still for a moment, her hand pressed flat against her ledger, and she breathed. She had $116. She had 92. The difference was $24, which she absolutely did not have. She turned to look at Frederick Collier, and he was already looking at her, and she could see that he had understood the same arithmetic at the same moment. I overbid, she said very quietly so that only he could hear. There was no panic in her voice. She was simply stating the situation factually, the way you acknowledge a problem before solving it. By $24, he said, equally quiet. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. I have that. You cannot give me $24, she said immediately. No, he agreed. I can loan it to you, terms to be discussed privately. She held his gaze for a long moment. He met it without wavering. She was trying to find the catch, and he let her look as long as she needed to because there was no catch, and eventually she would see that. Terms to be discussed, she repeated finally. Nothing unreasonable, he said. I promise you. After the gavel had settled the room back into its ordinary rhythm, after Julia had made her way to Harold Pryor's settlement table and completed the paperwork with Frederick walking quietly beside her, as he counted out the difference from his own wallet and pressed it into her hand without ceremony or audience. They walked out together into the bright June afternoon, with Goliath being walked to a holding area for her collection. The heat outside was immediate and direct, the kind of Kansas heat that finds you like a judgment. Julia stopped just outside the stockyard doors and turned to face Frederick with her ledger clasped against her chest and the early afternoon sun lighting the side of her face. You used your own ceiling on the bidding, she said. You spent it on me. Goliath was what you needed, he said simply. I'll find another animal. Frederick, she said his name with a firmness that made him pay attention. That was your money, all of it. It was, he said, and it bought something worth buying. He paused. Will you allow me to explain what I meant by discussing terms? I would rather do it somewhere that isn't a cattle yard, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment in that particular assessing way of hers that he was already beginning to recognize. Then she said, There's a decent eating house across the street. I saw it on my way in. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that changes a face entirely, warm and genuine and a little bit surprised, as though he hadn't expected the afternoon to unfold quite this way. "Then let's go across the street," he said. Dora's eating house was narrow and warm and smelled of cornbread and coffee, and the particular clean, honest smell of a place that is maintained with real pride. The woman who ran it, whose name turned out actually to be Dora, a stout and efficient woman of perhaps 50 with sharp eyes and a vast apron, sat them at a corner table without any comment on the strangeness of a woman and a man eating together without apparent familial connection. Julia appreciated that more than she could have said. They ordered coffee and 2 plates of the noon meal, which turned out to be beef stew and biscuits, hearty and uncomplicated. And then Frederick Collier laid out what he called his terms with a plainness that Julia recognized as a characteristic she already associated with him, which was the preference to say what he meant without decoration. He wanted nothing for the $24 in terms of money, he explained. He was not a banker and had no interest in charging interest. What he was proposing was this. The Hadley operation, from what he understood of its current state, needed more than one good bull. It needed a working relationship with a neighboring ranch that had some operational stability. He had been working his spread alone for 2 years, which was manageable but increasingly inefficient. There were things 2 operations working cooperatively could do that neither could do independently, particularly around seasonal cattle drives, water management during dry months, and negotiating for better terms at the railhead. He was not proposing anything binding or presumptuous, he said carefully. He was proposing a neighborly working relationship between 2 ranches that happened to share similar challenges and apparently similar common sense. Julia listened to all of this without interrupting. She sipped her coffee and watched him while he talked, and she noticed that he did not oversell anything, did not dramatize or exaggerate, did not make it sound more romantic or more advantageous than it was. He simply described the practical landscape as he saw it and offered to be a part of the solution. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You are making this very reasonable," she said at last. "I intend to," he said. "It makes me slightly suspicious," she told him honestly. "In my experience, things that are presented as entirely reasonable usually have a complication that only appears later." He nodded, taking that seriously rather than defensively. "Then I will add one complication now, so it doesn't appear later and surprise you." She raised an eyebrow. "I find your company considerably more interesting than I expected when I sat down beside you this morning," he said, and his voice was steady, but there was something open in it that had not been there when they were discussing cattle. "I don't know what that means yet, and I am not presuming anything from it. But I think you ought to know it, because I don't believe in starting something with a piece missing." Julia looked at him across the table for a long moment. The eating house hummed around them, a pair of merchants at another table, Dora moving efficiently between the kitchen and the room, the ordinary noises of midday in a Kansas cattle town. "I find your company tolerable," Julia said. And then, because she was her father's daughter and he had raised her to be honest, she added, "which for today is considerably more than I expected to say about anyone in that building." Frederick Collier smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes fully, and Julia felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something warm and unexpected and slightly terrifying. She ate her biscuit and told herself it was just the heat. The arrangement of taking Goliath home required organizing a hired drover from the stockyards to walk the bull alongside Julia's wagon for the 12 miles south, a service that cost $3 and which Frederick paid before she could protest, which she did anyway, and which he simply absorbed with the patient good nature of a man who has already decided what he is doing and sees no reason to debate it. They left Abilene in the late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow westward slide, and the air finally releasing some of the brutal midday heat. Frederick rode his own horse, a large and well-made bay gelding named Copernicus, which struck Julia as an extraordinary name for a cow horse, and she told him so. "My mother named him," Frederick explained, riding alongside her wagon at an easy pace while the drover walked Goliath behind them. She was a reader. She had opinions about names. "Your mother sounds like someone worth knowing," Julia said. "She was," he said, and the past tense settled quietly between them, and Julia understood and did not press. They rode south through the long Kansas afternoon, with the grass rolling out on either side of the road in great golden waves, and the sky doing the particular thing it does in Kansas in June, which is to become so enormously wide and blue overhead that you feel slightly suspended beneath it. Frederick told her about his operation, 1,200 acres east of the Smoky Hill River, a herd of 48 cattle currently, 3 full-time ranch hands, a bunkhouse that needed new roofing come fall, and a water situation that had been tense since a drought 2 summers ago had lowered the water table. He spoke about his land with the particular affection of a person who has built something with their hands and knows every corner of it. Julia told him about the Hadley Ranch, 640 acres, south of the river, the house her father had built himself in 1861, when he'd come west with nothing but a wagon and a determination that she'd always found awe-inspiring. The debt that had accumulated during his illness, which she was managing but which left no margin for error. The 23 cattle remaining, mostly cows, good stock but insufficient without strong breeding. A reliable well, an old but sound barn, and a small vegetable garden that she maintained because her mother had maintained it before her. Her mother had died when Julia was 14, a fact she stated plainly without drama because it was a plain fact, and Frederick received it the same way. "How long have you been managing the ranch alone?" he asked. "Since my father's health began failing, about 18 months ago," she said, "though he ran the decisions until the last 3 months." "You've been doing this effectively for 3 months, then." "More or less effectively," she said. "The more is the part I'm working on. Buying Goliath today is the more," he said. He glanced at him sideways, and there it was again, that small pull of warmth that she kept dismissing and which kept returning. "With considerable help," she said. "Teamwork," he said simply, and she laughed despite herself, a short, clean laugh that surprised her with its own easiness. They reached the junction where the road forked, his heading east and her south as the sun was getting low and orange, and Frederick pulled Copernicus up and she pulled her wagon to a stop. The drover with Goliath came up alongside. "I'll come by in a few days if that's agreeable," Frederick said. "I want to see you've got him settled properly, and we can talk more about the working arrangement." Julia looked at him. "A few days," she said. "3," he said. "4 at the outside." She nodded and gathered her reins. "Frederick," she paused. "What I said in the eating house about finding your company tolerable." He waited. "That was an understatement," she said. And then she clicked to her horse and drove south without looking back, and if she was smiling in a way she wouldn't entirely have been able to explain, there was no one on that empty road to see it. He came in 3 days, as he'd said. She saw the bay gelding coming up the road before she heard anything. The way you can see motion across open Kansas land from half a mile off if the air is clear, which it usually was in the mornings. She was at the corral fence checking on Goliath's adjustment to his new surroundings, which had been smooth, the bull being the calm and sensible animal his documentation had promised, and she watched Frederick Collier come up the road and felt that warm, complicated feeling again, and this time she stopped dismissing it and simply let it be there. He tipped his hat when he reached the fence. Copernicus nodded his great head as though sharing the sentiment. "He's settled in," she said, nodding toward Goliath. "I can see that." Frederick swung down from the saddle and leaned his arms on the top rail of the fence beside her. He smelled of outdoors and horses and a faint trace of soap, and he stood close enough that she was aware of the specific space he occupied, which she told herself was simply a function of the fence being narrow. They talked about Goliath for 20 minutes with the focused professional pleasure of 2 people who genuinely understand what they are talking about. He had observations about how to introduce the bull to the herd gradually, about timing, about which of her cows were likeliest to produce well with his bloodline. She had questions about what he had done with similar animals in the past, and he answered them completely and without condescension, which she noticed and appreciated. After that, they walked her fence line, because she had mentioned that the east section needed attention, and he had said he'd take a look with an extra set of eyes. He was useful in a practical and specific way, the kind of useful that doesn't make itself dramatic but simply gets things done. He found 2 places where the wire needed respanning and a gate post that was beginning to lean, and he did not offer to fix them for her but simply identified them clearly, which was what she had actually wanted. "Your east pasture has good grass," he said, looking out across the stretch of land on the other side of the fence. "My father always managed it well," she said. "He rotated the grazing carefully. Will you do the same?" "I already have been." She looked at him. "You don't have to manage whether I know what I'm doing, Frederick. I know what I'm doing." He turned to look at her, and he did not look chastened exactly, but he looked attentive in the specific way of a person taking an adjustment seriously. "Fair," he said. "I'll ask instead of assuming." "Asking is fine," she said. "Assuming tends to irritate me." "Noted," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "For the record, I have not once actually doubted whether you know what you're doing. You walked into Drummond's territory today, and you outbid him on the most desirable animal in the room. Whatever question I might have had about competence was answered somewhere around the $99 mark." Julia felt warmth move up the back of her neck, and she looked across the east pasture so that he couldn't see her face properly. "I went $24 over my ceiling," she pointed out. "And won," he said. "The outcome is what matters." They sat on the front porch of the Hadley house that afternoon and drank the coffee she made, which was strong and black, and exactly the way both of them preferred it, a discovery that felt disproportionately pleasing. She showed him the ledger she'd been maintaining for the ranch's income and expenses, because they had agreed to discuss the cooperative arrangement, and he looked through it with genuine attention and made 2 suggestions about record-keeping that were actually good suggestions, which she acknowledged and implemented immediately into her notation. He stayed until the shadows were getting long, and then he stood and picked up his hat and said he should get back before dark. "Same time next week?" she asked, and the question came out with more ease than she'd intended, which suggested she had given up on pretending it was purely a business arrangement some time ago without consciously deciding to. "I was thinking sooner than that," he said. He looked at her across the porch with those warm, steady eyes. "If that's all right." "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. He came Thursday. He came the following Tuesday as well, because there was a fence emergency on her south line that he had helped her think through during their last visit, and he wanted to know how it had resolved. And he came the Thursday after that, and by the time July had settled into its full deep heat, they had fallen into a rhythm that was half practical partnership and half something that neither of them had named yet, both of them moving carefully around the edges of the thing that was clearly happening, the way you move around a fire that is warm and welcome but commands a certain respect. He always brought something when he came. Not gifts exactly, nothing that presumptuous but practical things. A report from Abilene about railhead prices that season, a length of good wire he'd had extra of, once a jar of his late mother's preserved peaches that he'd found while clearing out the pantry, which he presented with a kind of careful casualness that completely failed to conceal the fact that it mattered to him whether she received it well. She received it very well. She ate half of them standing at her kitchen counter, and thought about the woman who had named a horse Copernicus, and raised a man who was kind without making a production of it. On a Wednesday evening in late July, after they had spent an afternoon checking on the first cows Goliath had been introduced to, and discussing the likely timing of the first calves, Julia made supper instead of sending him home before the light failed. It was a simple meal, pan-fried salt pork and the last of the spring potatoes from her garden with fresh cornbread, and they ate at the kitchen table with the door open to let the evening air through, and it was comfortable in a way that neither ordinary nor remarkable is quite the right word for, because it was both of those things simultaneously. It was the specific comfort of a situation that has become familiar exactly because it is right. He helped her wash the plates without being asked. She didn't tell him to stop, which was answer enough. They were standing at the kitchen window afterward, looking out at the last of the sunset going orange and rose over the south pasture, and he was close enough that, when he turned to say something, their shoulders were touching. And he said whatever he had intended to say, and then neither of them moved away from that contact, and the moment stretched out long and quiet, and the whole prairie was going quiet too, in the particular way it goes quiet at dusk when the daytime birds have stopped and the nighttime ones haven't started yet. "Julia," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. He turned to look at her fully, and she turned to look at him, and the last of the orange light was coming through the window, and neither of them had to say the rest of it out loud because it was entirely visible in the way they were looking at each other, which was no longer in any way that could be described as purely neighborly. "I don't want to be presumptuous," he said. "You've said that before," she told him. "And every time you've said it, you've also been correct about what the situation was. So you can trust your judgment on this one." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair that the evening wind had pulled loose back behind her ear, and his fingers were warm and careful against her jaw for just a moment, and she held very still because she wanted to feel every part of that specific moment. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you're willing." Julia looked at him for a long moment and thought about everything she had been managing alone for the past year and a half. The weight of it, the loneliness of it that she hadn't let herself feel too directly because there was always too much else to feel. She thought about sitting on that bench in the Abilene stockyards with 60 hostile men in the room and this particular man sitting down beside her, and asking about the weather as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She thought about what her father had said about him, the decent thing he had done with the water easement, the fair dealing, the man who wouldn't have mentioned it himself. "I'm willing," she said. The summer moved forward with the particular richness that summer has when something wonderful is occurring within it. Frederick came to the Hadley ranch 3 times a week, and she went to his operation on the occasional afternoon, as well to see how his herd was managed, and to meet his 3 ranch hands, who were named Cord Ezra, and a very young man of 19 called Pete who had a serious manner and a startling gift for working with horses. Frederick's ranch was well made and clearly tended with pride. The house was smaller than the Hadley house but in excellent repair, with a proper front porch and a vegetable garden that was, she had to admit, considerably better managed than hers, something she told him directly and which seemed to please him enormously. She met his nearest neighbors at a church social in early August, the Leavitt family to his north and the elderly widow Mrs. Carmichael to his south, who informed Julia within approximately 3 minutes of introduction that Frederick had been a reliable and decent neighbor for 2 years, and that she hoped Julia had sense enough to see what was in front of her, which Julia received with remarkable composure. Frederick, standing nearby, overheard this and turned slightly away so that Mrs. Carmichael would not see him laugh. The weeks that they spent in those long summer days were full of the kind of small revelations that accumulate into knowing a person. She discovered that he read voraciously, the same way his mother had, and kept 3 or 4 books going simultaneously, which he considered rational and she considered chaotic. And they had their first real argument about this, a warm and completely enjoyable argument that ended with her picking up one of his books and reading half of it in 2 days and returning to tell him that all right, that particular one was actually very good. He discovered that she had taught herself the basics of veterinary care out of necessity after her father's regular vet had moved north, and that her practical knowledge of cattle health was better than his, a fact he acknowledged immediately and without any of the wounded pride that might have characterized a less secure man. She discovered that he had a singing voice, unexpectedly good, that emerged only when he thought he was alone, and which he was mortified to have her overhear, and which she told him frankly was nothing to be mortified about. He discovered that she cried when she was angry rather than when she was sad, which had initially confused him until she explained it, and after which he handled it with precisely the right combination of patience and straight-talking that suited her exactly. In September, the first calves were born from Goliath's introduction to the Hadley herd, 4 of them in the first week, all strong and healthy, and Julia stood in the barn at 2 in the morning during the third birth with straw on her boots and her hair tied back and absolute focused joy on her face. And Frederick was there too, because he had ridden over when she'd sent Pete with a message that the second calf had come and more were likely. And he stood beside her in the lantern light while the third calf came into the world, and she did what needed doing with practiced capable hands. And when it was over and the calf was on its feet, and the mother was turning to look at it, he looked at her face in the warm lamplight and felt something so complete and full in his chest that it was almost overwhelming. She looked up and caught him looking at her. "What?" she said. He shook his head, but he was smiling. "Tell me," she said. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said plainly, "the way you state something that is simply a fact." The lantern moved between them in some small draught, throwing the shadows around, and Julia looked at him, and the joy that had been on her face for the calf was still there, but it had changed into something else, something quieter and more permanent. "Frederick," she said, "yes, I am in love with you." She said it the way she did most important things, directly and without preparation, because she had decided that this particular thing was too important to let habit or propriety make her indirect about. She needed him to know it clearly. "I want you to know that. I am not asking you for anything in return right now. I just want you to know." Frederick Collier crossed the barn floor in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands with enormous careful tenderness and kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that has nothing tentative in it because it has been coming for a long time, and is therefore exactly what it should be, certain and warm, and full of everything that had been building since a June morning in an Abilene stockyard. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, the way you rest against something that holds you up. "I love you," he said. "I think I have been in love with you since you bid $99 and I knew you had 92. She laughed, and it was the laugh of a person who is completely and fully happy in the way that comes only rarely and is therefore worth everything. The 4th calf came an hour later, healthy and loud, and they named it, entirely unofficially, Abilene, which she told him was absurd and which she allowed to stand. The formal proposal, when it came, was in October, on a Sunday afternoon with the Kansas countryside doing its October thing of being almost unbearably beautiful in amber and gold, and the particular pale blue of the sky when the summer heat has finally given way to something gentler. They were riding together along the creek that ran along the boundary of the Hadley property, a habit they'd developed of riding out together on Sunday afternoons when the week's work was done enough to permit it. He stopped Copernicus, and she stopped her own horse, a capable roan mare named Ada, and he reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small oval of deep blue stone set in it, and he held it in his palm and looked at her. He didn't make a speech. He said, simply and directly, "Will you marry me, Julia Hadley?" She looked at the ring in his palm for exactly 1 moment. The creek moved beside them. A hawk circled somewhere overhead. The whole wide Kansas sky waited. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it there, on her practical work-worn hand that had spent 18 months managing a ranch alone and had raised a bidding card in a room full of men who hadn't expected it, and it looked exactly right. They were married in November, at the Abilene First Methodist Church, on a Saturday morning with a cold, clear sky overhead and a light wind that made the women hold their hats and reddened everyone's noses and cheeks, and generally made the whole occasion feel more vivid and alive than it might otherwise have been. The ceremony was attended by Cord, Ezra, and young Pete from Frederick's ranch, along with their wives or families where they had them. Mrs. Carmichael came in a magnificent bonnet and sat in the front pew and wept through the entire proceeding in the specific satisfied way of a person who has been proven right about something they cared about. The Leavitt family filled 2 rows. Harold Pryor from the auction house came, having heard about the marriage from someone in town, and brought a gift of an excellent bottle of brandy that he presented with a bow. Dora from the eating house came and sat near the back and beamed through the whole proceeding. Silas Drummond, who had heard of the union in the way that people in small communities always hear everything whether they want to or not, did not come and was not invited. Frederick had learned, through conversation at the Abilene feed store the previous month, that Drummond had been making inquiries about the Hadley property, attempting to determine whether the debt situation might make it vulnerable to acquisition. Upon learning this, Frederick had gone directly to the county land office, and then to Julia's banker in Abilene, and between the 3 of them they had restructured the remaining Hadley debt into a term that was manageable and documented in a way that made any predatory acquisition approach considerably more difficult. He had told Julia about it that same evening, completely and without softening anything, and she had sat with it for a moment, and then asked several specific and intelligent questions about the legal arrangement, and then said thank you with a clarity that told him she understood what he had done and why, and the matter was settled between them. Drummond found other things to occupy himself with, and the Hadley operation was no longer on his list of easy targets. That was enough. The wedding itself was simple and right, and exactly what it was supposed to be. When the minister said the words and Frederick placed the companion gold band on her finger beside his mother's ring, and she put her hand against his chest to feel his heartbeat there, as she had found herself wanting to do for months, she felt something settle in her bones that was the specific feeling of arriving somewhere you have been traveling toward without fully knowing it. Mrs. Collier, he said quietly, after the minister had said the official thing, and his voice on those 2 words held more than any man had ever put into her name. Mr. Collier, she said back, and smiled at him with her whole face. They moved into the Hadley house together after a brief discussion that was entirely practical, and that Julia greatly appreciated for being entirely practical. Her house was larger. His was better maintained. They would make her house the home, and invest some of both their resources in its ongoing upkeep. His bunkhouse would remain operational for his hands. The 2 operations would function cooperatively under a shared management structure that they designed together over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. It was, as arrangements go, sensible and thorough and reflective of 2 people who respected each other's minds. But living together was more than an arrangement, and they both understood that very quickly. It was the small, daily accumulating business of being in close proximity to another person in all their actual reality, not just the parts that present well on a Sunday afternoon ride. It was learning the sounds of another person's morning and the particular way they fill a kitchen with their presence, and the things they do when they're worried that are different from the things they do when they're content. Frederick worried quietly, she discovered. He got very focused and slightly distant, not unkindly so, but inward, and she learned to recognize it and to give him space for it and to ask once and directly whether he wanted to talk, and if he said not yet to leave it until he came to her, which he always did, usually by the end of the same day. Julia worried actively. She cleaned things. She reorganized the kitchen and the barn storage and the ledger records when something was troubling her, so that the house and the operation got very well organized in inverse proportion to how settled she was feeling. Frederick found this endearing in a way he was wise enough to express carefully, and she found his observation of it somewhere between annoying and deeply comforting, which she acknowledged when she was in a charitable mood. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was cold and hard in the way that Kansas winters can be. The kind of cold that finds every gap in a wall and tests every piece of livestock you own. They lost 2 of the older cows to a late January cold snap that dropped the temperature to something brutal and stayed there for 4 days. It was the kind of loss you felt in the body as well as in the ledger, and Julia stood in the barn the morning they found the second one and was quiet for a long time, and Frederick stood beside her without saying anything because there was nothing useful to say, just standing there with her while she felt what she felt. "It's a hard business," she said finally. "It is," he said. She straightened her shoulders, which he recognized. "We still have 49 cattle between the 2 operations and 8 of the herd pregnant. We'll come through it." "We will," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Are you agreeing with me or encouraging me?" "Both," he said honestly. "Is that all right?" she considered. "Yes, both is fine." They came through it. The spring of 1879 brought a wave of new calves, 15 in total across the combined herd, the product of Goliath's first full season on the Hadley land, and a strong young bull Frederick had acquired from a reputable breeder in central Kansas the previous fall. The calves were strong, and the losses from winter were more than offset. And the ledger, for the first time in the Hadley Ranch's recent history, showed something that looked like actual forward motion rather than managed retreat. Julia sat at the kitchen table in April with the ledger open and ran the numbers 3 different ways to make sure she had not made an arithmetic error, and then she called Frederick in from the yard where he was talking with Cord about the spring fencing work. He came in, and she handed him the ledger, and he read the numbers and looked up at her. "That's right," she said. "I checked it 3 times." He sat down across from her and looked at the numbers again, and then he looked at her face, and what was on his face was the specific joy of a person watching someone they love receive something they have worked very hard for and deserve completely. "Julia," he said. "Don't make me cry," she said immediately. "I'm not going to cry about a ledger." "I wouldn't dream of it," he said. She was crying slightly, which she attributed to the brightness of the spring light coming through the window and which he accepted without comment. In the summer of 1879, she discovered she was pregnant, and she told him on a Tuesday evening sitting on the front porch in the June heat with her coffee cup warming her hands and the fireflies beginning in the south pasture, the same south pasture her father had built his operation around. The same grass that her mother had looked at from this porch. The same deep and generous Kansas sky overhead. She had known for a week and had thought carefully about how to tell him, and in the end she simply told him directly because that was who she was. "We're going to have a child," she said. He was still for a moment, the way he went still when something large landed on him. And then he turned to look at her, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before, something fully open and unguarded, and he reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it and didn't say anything for a long moment because he was clearly working through a great deal of feeling. "Are you well?" he asked at last, which was not what she had expected him to say first and was exactly the right thing. "I'm well," she said, "tired but well." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, a gesture that she had come to associate entirely with him and that she would have been happy to feel for the rest of her life. "Good," he said. "That's what matters." They sat on the porch in the June dark for a long time after that, her hand in both of his and the fireflies lighting up the pasture and the sounds of the summer night all around them. And it was one of those evenings that you know you will carry with you for the rest of your life while it is still happening. He was extraordinary during her pregnancy, in the specific practical and attentive way that was characteristic of him, nothing performative or anxious, simply a steady rearranging of what needed to be done, and how it was done so that she was not carrying more than was sensible. He took on more of the physical work of the operation without comment. He learned enough about cooking to manage the kitchen on the evenings when she was too tired, which produced results of varying quality that she consumed without complaint and complimented honestly when they merited it. She continued running the business side of the operation, because that was not physically taxing, and because she was very good at it and had no intention of stopping. She had been corresponding with Harold Pryor at the auction house about the next season's considerations, and she had also written to a cattle breeder in Missouri whose bloodline records she had been studying and who she had a specific question for. She handled all of this from the kitchen table with her ledger and her correspondence and her strong coffee, and the operation was the better for it. In October, Silas Drummond made one more appearance in their lives, though fortunately not in any physical sense. A notice arrived from the county land office, indicating that Drummond had filed a claim on a water source that fed a tributary used by several smaller operations in the county, including properties adjacent to both the Hadley Collier Range and the Leavitt property to the north. It was the kind of legal maneuvering that was his specialty, technically within the territory of the existing water laws, which in Kansas in 1879 were not always written in favor of the smaller operator. Julia read the notice twice and then set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then picked up a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a letter. She wrote to the county seat. She wrote to a lawyer in Abilene who had a reputation for knowing territorial water law, and she wrote to Thomas Leavitt next door, whose cooperation would be necessary for any collective challenge to be effective. Frederick, reading over her shoulder at one point while she was composing the third letter, said nothing for a moment and then said, "You are extraordinary, do you know that?" "I am organized," she said, not looking up from the letter. "Which is not the same thing." "In this case it is," he said. The challenge to Drummond's water claim was filed collectively by 4 ranching operations in December, with the assistance of the Abilene attorney, a methodical and capable man named Archibald Howe, who had done this kind of work before, and who told them bluntly that the odds were reasonable if not certain. It went through the legal process over the following months with the grinding, deliberate pace of territorial legal proceedings, requiring patience and occasional additional documentation, and Julia managed the correspondence for all 4 operations with an efficiency that both Howe and the Leavitts found remarkable. In February of 1880, when Julia was 7 months pregnant and the winter had settled into its second long cold spell, she sat across from Frederick at the kitchen table with a letter from Archibald Howe that said the water claim challenge had been upheld by the county court and that Drummond's filing had been denied. She read the letter to Frederick across the table with the lamp between them and the winter wind pushing at the windows. When she finished, he said, "Read it again." She did, and then she set it on the table between them and looked at him. "Your father would have been pleased," he said quietly. She felt the truth of that land in the center of her chest. Her father had spent years working this land and working with these neighbors, and managing the particular challenges of building something good in a territory that didn't always make it easy. He would have been pleased. He would have been sitting at this very table with his ledger and his strong coffee, and that particular expression he had when something went right, which was quiet and deep and not in any way small. He would have, she said. And she was crying again, which she acknowledged this time without attribution to any external factor, and Frederick simply moved his chair around to her side of the table and sat beside her with his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him. "We built something good," he said. "We are building something good," she corrected. "Still building," he agreed. Their son was born on a Saturday in early March of 1880, on a morning that arrived with thin, pale winter light, and then graduated, as the hours went on, into something brighter and warmer. Julia worked through the labor with the same determined, focused energy she brought to most hard things, and Frederick was with her the entire time, entirely steady in the specific way he was steady when things required it. The baby was healthy and loud, and possessed of a remarkable quantity of dark hair that was clearly his father's. He weighed a good and solid amount, and when Frederick held him for the first time, sitting in the chair beside the bed with this entirely new person cradled in his large, careful hands, the expression on his face was the most completely undefended thing Julia had ever seen from him, every guard down, every careful reserve set aside, just this enormous quiet wonder. "What do we call him?" Frederick said, still looking at the baby. Julia had thought about this for months, and she had decided clearly. "Robert Frederick Collier," she said, "after my father and after his." Frederick looked up at her, and his eyes were bright in the morning light. "If that's agreeable," she added. "It's everything," he said simply. Robert Frederick Collier was not a quiet baby, and both of them were awakened at irregular hours in those early months with the particular determined insistence of an infant who has decided that the world should be organized around his needs immediately. Frederick took the night feedings with remarkable good humor, because Julia was handling the nursing, but there were gaps between, and he seemed to approach the business of night waking with the same patient competence he brought to midnight calvings, which Julia told him she found equal parts amusing and sincerely admirable. The spring of 1880 brought the herd to its best numbers since before her father's illness. 63 cattle across the combined operation, 17 of them calves from that year's season, the majority strong and promising. The water situation was resolved. The debt on the Hadley property was down to a final manageable amount. The cooperative arrangement between the two operations, formalized now in their marriage and in practice for nearly 2 years, had produced efficiencies that neither of them could have achieved individually. Young Pete, Frederick's ranch hand with the gift for horses, had also recently married a girl from the Leavitt family, which delighted Mrs. Carmichael enormously when she heard, and which Mrs. Carmichael reported to Julia at the first opportunity, as though it were news Julia was not already aware of, having attended the wedding. That summer, she sat on the front porch in the evenings with Robert in her lap and Frederick beside her, and the baby would watch the fireflies in the south pasture with the absolute absorbed attention of a person for whom fireflies are still entirely new and miraculous, which of course they were. "I have been thinking," she said on one such evening in August, with the heat finally beginning to ease in the evenings and the sky going purple and gold in the west. "About," Frederick said from the neighboring chair, "about buying the Miller parcel. The Miller family had moved north the previous spring, leaving their adjacent 160 acres vacant. She had been watching it. She had been calculating. The grass is good. The eastern fence is already connected to our east line. If we could acquire it before the spring season, we could expand the herd significantly." Frederick was quiet for a moment with the thoughtful look that meant he was taking something seriously. "What's the asking?" "Thomas Miller left it with Howe's office for representation. I wrote to Archibald Howe last week." He turned to look at her. "Last week." "I wanted to have the figures before I brought it to you," she said. "Here." She reached under the chair and produced her ledger, the same ledger she'd had at the Abilene stockyards, now nearly full and bearing the marks of 2 years of careful management, and she handed it to him with the relevant page open. He read it in the failing light. He turned 2 pages, reading figures. Robert made a determined sound and grabbed at the ledger, and Julia removed it gently from his grasp. "That's a working document," she told her son, who appeared unmoved by this. Frederick said, "We could do it. It would be tight in the first year. We'd need to hold the herd steady and not expand until the second spring." "I know," she said. "That's what the numbers show." "Then let's write to Howe," he said. She smiled. "I already asked for the figures. I didn't commit to anything." "No," he said, and he was smiling too, "you wouldn't." They acquired the Miller parcel that November, 160 acres adjoining their east line, which brought the total Collier operation to just over 1,000 acres and created one of the sounder mid-sized ranching enterprises in that part of Dickinson County. It was not the largest spread, not even close, but it was managed well and debt structurally sound and built on good land with good stock, and all of that mattered more in the long run than size alone. When the deed came through, and Frederick brought it home from the county land office on a Thursday afternoon, Julia was in the kitchen with Robert on a blanket on the floor, and the afternoon sun coming in strong through the south window. He laid the deed on the table and she read it through carefully and looked up at him. 1,063 acres, she said. Give or take, he said. She stood and came to him and took his face in her hands, the way he had done to her that evening in the kitchen when the summer was young and everything was just beginning, and she looked at him directly. We did this, she said. You and I, yes, he said. My father always said the right place and the right partnership were worth more than anything you could name, she told him. He was talking about cattle breeding and water rights when he said it. But I think he might have been talking about something else too. Frederick put his hands over hers on his face. I think you're right, he said. She kissed him warmly and thoroughly, and Robert, from his blanket on the floor, made an opinion-laden sound that suggested he felt the adult world was spending insufficient time attending to him. He's going to be opinionated, Frederick observed, looking at his son. He is his mother's child, Julia said serenely. By the spring of 1882, the Collier operation was running 80 head and employing 4 full-time hands, including Pete and Cord and 2 new men, brothers named Samuel and William Briggs, who had come up from Texas with good references and proved themselves worth keeping in the first season. Julia had expanded her veterinary knowledge through a correspondence with a trained animal doctor in Kansas City, a progressive man named Dr. Elias Park, who had been willing to write to her seriously about cattle health management, which she treated with the same thorough attention she brought to everything. The herd's health management under her approach had reduced loss rates considerably below what they had been in the early years. She was also, in the spring of 1882, pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others, the harder parts involving an energetic 2-year-old who had definite ideas about how the household should be organized and who was, as predicted, extremely opinionated. Robert Collier, at 2 years old, was bold and curious and entirely fearless in the specific alarming way of small children who have not yet learned what fear is for, and managing him required the specific combination of structure and creativity that Julia had applied to every other management challenge in her life, which Frederick observed with deep amusement. Their daughter arrived in October of 1882, on a crisp fall day with the cottonwoods along the creek going gold. She was smaller than Robert had been but equally determined, with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's dark hair, and a quality of focused attention in her gaze from the very first day that Julia recognized with a complicated and joyful feeling. Eleanor, Julia said when Frederick asked. Eleanor Rose Collier. He looked down at his daughter in his arms, this new small person, and said her name quietly as though testing the weight of it. Eleanor Rose, he said, and then looking up at Julia, that's exactly right. Robert, brought in to meet his sister, regarded the baby with careful scientific attention, and then attempted to give her one of his building blocks, which she was not developmentally equipped to receive, and he had to be persuaded to leave her be, but the intention was unmistakable and enormously charming. The years that followed were built in the way good years are built, not from the absence of difficulty, but from the accumulation of what you manage to make from difficulty and ordinary time and work and love. There were hard seasons, a drought in the summer of 1883 that tested the whole county and required real ingenuity to manage without major herd loss, which they achieved through careful water rationing and the relationship they had built with the Leavitt family. There was a difficult winter in early 1885 that took a dozen cattle and required a complete rebuild of the south barn after a structural failure, which Frederick and Samuel Briggs managed over 6 weeks of hard work in brutal cold. There was an outbreak of blackleg in the fall of that same year that required every piece of knowledge Julia had accumulated about herd health to contain, and she worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks and saved the majority of the affected animals, and the loss was painful but not catastrophic. Through all of it, they remained what they had been since that first auction morning, a partnership of equals who had chosen each other with full information and genuine respect, and something that only grew deeper and more particular with the passing of time. Robert grew into a boy who loved the land with the same intensity his grandfather had, who could ride before he was 4, and who by 7 was accompanying Frederick on morning checks of the herd, and asking questions about cattle management that surprised the hands with their sophistication. He had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, which was a combination that served him well in most situations, and occasionally got him into interesting difficulties in others. Eleanor grew into a girl who loved books with the same intensity her paternal grandmother had, who could read well before she started school, and who absorbed information with the specific rapid pleasure of a person for whom learning is intrinsically delightful. She had her mother's clear hazel eyes and her father's patient attentiveness, and she had a particular gift for drawing that emerged around age 5, and that both her parents encouraged without any attempt to direct it toward practical application, recognizing that some gifts are worth cultivating simply for what they are. Frederick built a bookshelf for Eleanor's room when she was 6, a proper full-height bookshelf with proper proportions, made from good wood with careful joints, and the care that went into the making of that single piece of furniture was visible in every detail, which Eleanor noted and appreciated in the particular way children appreciate things done for them by people they love. In 1887, when Robert was 7 and Eleanor 4, Julia made her second trip to Abilene for a cattle auction, this time with Frederick beside her on the wagon rather than sitting beside her on a bench by coincidence. And this time the reception at the stockyards was different. Not because the world had changed so dramatically in 9 years. It had changed some, but not dramatically. But because the people in that room recognized the Collier name now, associated it with a well-run operation and a sound reputation. And because the woman behind the Collier name had been running correspondence with Harold Pryor's auction house for nearly a decade, and was known to be exactly as competent as anyone had ever claimed. They sat in the second row, Frederick and Julia, with their shared bidding paddle and their shared ledger, and their shared knowledge of exactly what they had come for, and what they were willing to spend. Harold Pryor, looking somewhat wider around the middle and considerably grayer, but exactly as cheerful as he had always been, saw them from his platform and tilted his head in a specific respectful acknowledgement that made Frederick notice and Julia pretend not to notice but appreciate entirely. They won the bid on a young Hereford bull of exceptional bloodline at a reasonable price, the bidding competitive but clean, with none of the drama of 1878. On the drive home in the late afternoon sun, with their new bull behind them and the familiar Kansas landscape rolling in every direction, Frederick was quiet for a while in the companionable way that had characterized so many of their drives over the years. "Do you remember the first time we drove this road?" he said. She glanced at him. "I remember every detail of it," she said. "I was terrified you had some scheme I hadn't seen through yet. And I was terrified you would tell me to mind my own business and ride away. I almost did," she admitted, "twice." He looked at her sideways. "Twice. Once at the auction when you first sat down. And once at the split in the road when you said you'd come in 3 days. I almost told you not to." He was quiet for a moment. "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly. "Your face," she said at last. "The way you looked at me. There was nothing in it I needed to be suspicious of." She paused. "And because my father taught me that fair dealing is rarer than it ought to be, and when you encounter it you should not walk away from it out of habit." He reached across and took her hand on the seat between them and held it for a long moment, his eyes on the road. "Good man, your father," he said. "He was," she said, "and he would have liked you." "I would have liked him," Frederick said. "I think I already did." The road unrolled before them in the late gold light, familiar and right, 12 miles south toward the house her father had built and the land they were building together, toward the 2 children who were probably giving Mrs. Carmichael, who had agreed to sit with them, a complete education in what determined and opinionated children are capable of on a long Tuesday afternoon. The operation that had been one woman alone with 23 cattle and a debt, and a determination that the world had tried to tell her was insufficient, was now something her father would have looked at with deep satisfaction. 1,000 acres in good order, a herd approaching 90 head, a house that was full and warm and well kept, a partnership between two people that had proven itself through drought and hard winter and legal battles, and the ordinary miraculous daily work of building a life together. That evening, with the new bulls settled in the south pasture, and Robert telling both of them in authoritative detail about everything that had happened at home during their absence, and Alina showing Julia a drawing she had made of Copernicus, who was getting on in years now and more distinguished than ever in his movements, Julia sat at the kitchen table with the household ledger open, and a cup of strong coffee at her elbow and Frederick across from her reading his current book. And the kitchen was warm from the stove, and Robert's voice had wound down into the slower, quieter version of itself that preceded sleep, and Alina had curled up in the chair by the window with one of her own books and was making her way through it with absolute focused contentment. Outside, the Kansas prairie was going dark the way it goes dark in the fall, early and complete, and the first stars were coming out in the velvet above the south pasture, and the cattle were moving slowly in the way cattle move in the evening, unhurried and soundly managed. Julia ran her finger down a column of figures and made a small notation in the ledger's margin, a habit her father had started, and she had continued. Small observations beside the numbers that told the story the numbers couldn't tell by themselves. She wrote, September 1887, Abilene auction, 1 bull acquired, herd at 89 head, south barn repaired last spring and sound, east pasture rotation completed, both children well, Frederick well, self well. She looked at that last line and crossed out self well and wrote, everything exactly right. She looked across the table at Frederick, who was reading, unaware of being watched, and she felt the full and settled weight of everything they had made together, and it was the best feeling she had ever known. As though he felt her eyes, he looked up from his page. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, the way he had looked at her on a bench in Abilene 9 years ago when the room was full of men who didn't want her there, with that same open and uncomplicated and genuine attention. Nothing hidden, nothing restrained, all of it right there in his face. All right, he said. All right, she said, and meant it completely and fully and without any reservation in the world. Outside, the prairie held them all in its enormous and generous dark, the stars coming out one by one above 1,000 acres that bore their name and the name of the man before her who had believed in this land and given it to her. And the sound of the wind in the grass was the same sound it had always been, vast and clean, and full of everything that might still come, all of it ahead, all of it possible, the whole wide horizon waiting with the particular patient promise of the western land. Julia Hadley Collier closed her ledger and picked up her coffee cup and smiled across the table at her husband, and in the chair by the window Alina turned a page, and from upstairs came the sound of Robert Collier finally surrendering to sleep, and Frederick set his book spine up on the table and reached across and covered her hand with his. The lamp burned warm between them. Outside, the prairie breathed. And in the south pasture, a new bull stood solid and sound beneath the enormous Kansas stars, the beginning of another season, another herd, another year of building something good in this wide and difficult and beautiful land, which was all that any of it had ever been, she thought, and all that any of it ever needed to be, the beginning of the next good thing.